The call came in the middle of the afternoon. A friendly voice, a familiar tone, someone who seemed to know things, your name, maybe your neighborhood, sometimes your bank. The script was simple, and it worked. You had won something, or you owed something, or someone you loved was in trouble. All you had to do was act fast and not tell anyone. Telephone fraud targeting elderly Americans did not begin with the internet. It did not begin with cryptocurrency or artificial intelligence or call centers in Southeast Asia. It began with the telephone itself, a technology that gave strangers direct access to people inside their own homes at any hour, with no warning and no verification. By the 1980s, federal law enforcement was already documenting organized telephone fraud operations specifically designed to target older Americans. The reasons were not mysterious then and are not mysterious now. Americans over 65 tend to have accumulated wealth, retirement savings, home equity, pension income. They are more likely to be home during daytime hours when calls arrive. They grew up in a culture where a ringing telephone was answered and where the caller was presumed to have a legitimate reason for calling. They were raised to be polite, to hear people out, to give the benefit of the doubt. Scammers understood this before researchers did. The demographic targeting of elderly Americans was not accidental. It was the result of calculated decisions about who had money, who could be reached, and who was least likely to hang up. What has changed between the 1980s and today is not the fundamental logic of the crime. It is the technology, the scale, the sophistication, and the dollar amounts. The losses that telephone fraud inflicted on American seniors in the 1980s were significant. What is happening now is something categorically different, and the numbers tell a story that most Americans have never been asked to fully absorb. In 2020, losses from elder fraud reached $600 million. Before the pandemic, the financial exploitation of elderly Americans was a documented and growing problem, but one that had not yet crossed into the territory of national emergency. The Federal Trade Commission tracked fraud losses reported by older adults, and the numbers were serious enough to demand attention, but not yet large enough to dominate policy conversations or generate sustained media coverage. In 2020, adults aged 60 and older reported losing approximately $600 million to fraud through the Federal Trade Commission's Consumer Sentinel Network. That figure was already the product of a decade of steady escalation, the result of expanding digital access, growing use of social media among older Americans, and a criminal ecosystem that had progressively refined its methods of targeting and extracting money from the elderly. The $600 million figure also reflected a fundamental limitation of the data. It captured only what was reported. The Federal Trade Commission has consistently acknowledged that the vast majority of elder fraud goes unreported. Victims feel shame. They fear that their families will question their judgment or move to restrict their financial independence. They worry that law enforcement cannot help, and in many cases they simply do not know that what happened to them was a crime, because the scammers they encountered were skilled enough to frame what they did as a legitimate transaction. A study in New York State found that for every 44 cases of elder financial abuse, only one is reported to authorities. If that ratio applies to the Consumer Sentinel data from 2020, the true losses that year were not $600 million. They were closer to $26 billion. That was the baseline. What followed, year by year, was a compounding catastrophe. In 2021, losses jumped 74% to $1.7 billion. The COVID-19 pandemic did not create elder fraud, but it created conditions that amplified it in ways no one had fully anticipated. Lockdowns, social isolation, the closure of in-person services, and a forced shift to digital communication all produced a population of older Americans who were more isolated, more dependent on technology, and more vulnerable to manipulation than at any point in recent memory. In 2021, the FBI's Internet Crime Complaint Center recorded losses from elder fraud that reached $1.7 billion. a 74% increase from the year prior. More than 92,000 victims aged 60 and older filed complaints with the FBI's Internet Crime Complaint Center that year. The average loss per victim was $18,350. The specific fraud categories driving these losses reflected the pandemic landscape. Government impersonation scams surged, with criminals posing as representatives of the IRS, the Social Security Administration, and Medicare, agencies that had become central to the daily lives of elderly Americans managing stimulus payments, vaccine appointments, and healthcare benefits during the public health crisis. Tech support scams exploded as more seniors went online to communicate with family, access services, and manage their finances. The isolation factor was not incidental. Social isolation is one of the strongest predictors of vulnerability to fraud. When older Americans were cut off from their regular social networks, church communities, senior centers, weekly family gatherings, neighborhood interactions, they became more susceptible to the artificial connection that scammers offered. A friendly voice on the phone, a concerned message from an online contact, an email from someone who seemed to know them and care about them. The 74% jump in losses from 2020 to 2021 was the sharpest single-year increase on record at that point. It would not remain the record for long. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our upcoming updates on the situation in the United States. Thank you for your support, and let's continue. In 2024, seniors lost $4.9 billion. By 2024, elder fraud had metastasized into one of the largest financial crime categories in the United States. The annual report from the FBI's Internet Crime Complaint Center, released in April of 2025, documented the scale of what had occurred. Adults aged 60 and older filed 147,127 complaints with the FBI's Internet Crime Complaint Center in 2024. Total reported losses reached $4.885 billion. That represented a 46% increase in complaints from 2023 and a 43% increase in losses. The average loss per senior victim in 2024 was $83,000, a figure that by itself tells a story about who these criminals are targeting and how they are operating. This is not petty theft. This is the systematic extraction of retirement savings, home equity, and lifetime financial security from people who built that security over decades of work. The investment fraud category drove the largest share of losses, with more than $1.8 billion reported lost by Americans over 60. The Federal Trade Commission's parallel data showed that investment scams targeting older adults were increasingly concentrated in the highest loss brackets, the cases involving individual losses of $100,000 or more. These catastrophic individual losses accounted for 68% of total reported elder fraud losses in 2024. In the Boston FBI division alone, covering Maine, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Rhode Island, total reported elder fraud losses in 2024 were $134,935,643, and those were only the cases that were reported. The Federal Trade Commission estimated that the true losses experienced by older adults in 2024 may have reached $81.5 billion. Pig butchering cryptocurrency scams now dominate elder fraud losses. The name comes from the Mandarin phrase sha ju pan, fattening the pig before slaughter. It originated in organized criminal compounds in Southeast Asia, initially targeting Chinese language victims before expanding globally. By 2024 and 2025, it had become the single largest fraud category by dollar loss in the United States, and elderly Americans were its most financially devastated victims. The mechanics are patient and deliberate. A stranger makes contact through a dating app, a social media platform, or a seemingly misdirected text message. The contact is friendly, interested, attentive. Over weeks or months, a relationship develops. The scammer learns about the victim's life, their finances, their hopes for the future, their fears. Then, at some point in the relationship, the scammer mentions an investment opportunity, usually cryptocurrency, usually on a platform that the scammer personally vouches for. The victim watches their investment appear to grow. The fake dashboard shows spectacular returns. They invest more. They encourage family members to invest. Then they try to withdraw, and everything disappears. Investment fraud affecting seniors accounted for $3.5 billion in reported losses to the FBI in 2025 alone. Cryptocurrency fraud losses across all age groups reached $7.2 billion that year. The complaint volume for cryptocurrency fraud among elderly Americans jumped 79% in a single year. These operations are not run by individual criminals working alone. They are organized industrial-scale criminal enterprises. In November of 2025, Myanmar military forces arrested nearly 1,600 foreign nationals during a raid on scam compounds along the Thai border. Many of those arrested were themselves trafficking victims, people forced to work in the compounds under threat of violence, running fraudulent relationships with American seniors around the clock. The money, once it leaves a victim's account and enters a cryptocurrency wallet, is virtually impossible to recover. AI voice cloning made the grandparent scam nearly undetectable. The grandparent scam has existed in various forms for decades. The core script is simple. Someone calls an elderly person claiming to be a grandchild in trouble, arrested, injured, stranded, and asks for money immediately, urgently, and secretly. Do not tell anyone. Not your other children, not your bank. Just get the money and get it fast. For years, the scam's principal vulnerability was the voice. An alert grandparent might notice that the caller did not quite sound right. The accent was off. The cadence was wrong. The way they said certain words did not match the grandchild they had known for decades. Artificial intelligence has eliminated that vulnerability. Consumer-grade AI voice synthesis tools capable of cloning a person's voice from as little as 3 seconds of audio became widely available starting around 2023. Scammers find source material on social media posts, YouTube videos, voicemail greetings, and family videos posted publicly online. The cloned voice can then be deployed in real-time phone calls, adapting to what the victim says, sounding exactly in pitch, in cadence, in the specific verbal patterns, like the person the victim loves. An 86-year-old grandmother in Philadelphia received a phone call in 2024 from what she believed was her granddaughter. The granddaughter said she had been detained by police after an accident. She needed money. The grandmother agreed to help, $6,000 in cash, which the scammers collected in person. When she learned the accident was a fabrication and her granddaughter had been at work all along, she said she would never have fallen for it had she not recognized her granddaughter's voice on the phone. She did recognize it. She recognized it because it was her granddaughter's voice. The FBI has issued public service announcements warning that AI voice cloning can produce an 85% voice match from 3 seconds of source audio. In 2025, seniors lost $7.7 billion. The acceleration did not slow. It accelerated. The FBI's 2025 Internet Crime Complaint Center annual report, released in April of 2026, documented losses from elder fraud that shattered every previous record. Adults aged 60 and older filed 201,266 complaints in 2025, a 37% increase from the prior year. Their reported losses reached $7.7 billion, a 59% jump from 2024. The average loss per victim exceeded $38,000. The specific crimes driving the largest losses were investment fraud at $3.5 billion, tech support scams at $1 billion, and romance and confidence fraud at $584 million. At the same time, the overall scale of internet-based crime in the United States reached $20.9 billion, a 26% increase over 2024. Americans in their 30s and 40s, the age group just below senior status, reported $4.6 billion in losses. Seniors accounted for $7.7 billion. The elderly are not merely the largest category of fraud victims by dollar loss. The gap between them and every other age group is widening. The AI-generated fraud component of these losses is now formally tracked by the FBI. The Bureau reported $893 million in losses tied to AI-related scams in 2025, including voice cloning for family distress calls and deepfakes used in investment schemes. Adults over 60 accounted for $352 million of those AI-specific losses. From 2020 to 2025, losses reported by older Americans to the FBI grew from approximately $600 million to $7.7 billion. That is an increase of more than 1,200% in 5 years. Only 1 in 44 elder fraud cases is ever reported. The numbers that appear in the FBI and FTC annual reports are significant. They are also, by every available estimate, a profound undercount of what is actually happening. A study conducted in New York State found that for every 44 cases of elder financial abuse that occur, only 1 is ever reported to any authority. The Federal Trade Commission, which collects its own parallel database of fraud complaints, has stated explicitly that the vast majority of elder fraud goes unreported. In its annual report to Congress released in late 2025, the FTC estimated that the true losses experienced by older adults in 2024 may have been as high as $81.5 billion, compared to the $2.4 billion actually reported to the agency. The gap between reported and actual losses reflects a specific set of barriers that are disproportionately concentrated among elderly victims. Shame is the most consistently documented. Older Americans who have been defrauded frequently describe intense embarrassment, a fear that disclosing the fraud will lead their families to question their competence or move to restrict their financial autonomy. The FBI explicitly identifies this dynamic in its annual report, noting that shame and fear of losing financial independence may prevent seniors from reporting even when they know what happened to them. Only 23% of people aged 70 to 79 who are defrauded report the fraud, compared to 43% of people in their 20s. The disparity reflects not differences in victimization rates, but differences in reporting behavior. The consequences of underreporting extend beyond the individual victim. Law enforcement cannot identify patterns, connect cases across state lines, or dismantle criminal networks when only 1 in 44 victims makes a report. The $7.7 billion in losses documented by the FBI in 2025 is the visible surface of a vastly larger financial catastrophe. 38 senior fraud victims needed suicide intervention in 2025. The FBI's Operation Level Up was launched in January of 2024 with a specific and unusual mission. Rather than waiting for fraud victims to come forward, the operation proactively identified Americans who were actively being victimized by cryptocurrency investment fraud and contacted them before they lost everything. In 2025, Operation Level Up notified 3,780 victims of active scams. The estimated savings from those interventions totaled $225 million. 78% of the people contacted had no idea they were being scammed at the time. The individual cases documented in the FBI's report illustrate the scale of individual losses that the operation was preventing. One victim was stopped from cashing out $750,000 from a retirement account. Another was prevented from selling a home to generate $500,000 for an investment that did not exist. A third was about to take out a loan to send $400,000 to criminals. And then there were 38 cases that went beyond financial intervention. 38 victims of elder fraud in 2025 were referred by Operation Level Up to FBI victim specialists for suicide intervention. These were not people who had lost a few $100s to a phone scam. These were people, elderly Americans, who had lost so much so completely, so irreversibly, that they had reached the point of considering ending their lives over what had been taken from them: their retirement savings, their sense of security. In some cases, the money they had planned to leave to their children and grandchildren. The romance scam victim who believed they had found a companion in their final years, only to discover that person had never existed. The 38 referrals for suicide intervention in a single year are among the most consequential statistics in this entire crisis, and among the least reported. The FTC estimates real losses may reach $81.5 billion annually. The number on the surface is $7.7 billion. That is what elderly Americans reported losing to fraud in 2025, according to the FBI's Internet Crime Complaint Center. It is a number large enough to be shocking. It is also, by the FTC's own estimate, a fraction of the actual total. The Federal Trade Commission, in its annual report to Congress on protecting older consumers, released in late 2025, provided its most explicit estimate yet of the true scale of elder financial fraud. Based on reporting rates and population-level victimization estimates, the FTC projected that the real losses experienced by older adults in 2024 may have been as high as $81.5 billion. $81.5 billion in a single year, against a population of approximately 55 million Americans aged 65 and older. Deloitte's Center for Financial Services projected in a separate analysis that AI-generated fraud alone will reach $40 billion in damages in the United States by 2027, a 32% annual growth rate. That projection was made before the full capabilities of the agentic AI systems, which can autonomously browse the web, maintain extended conversations, and execute complex social engineering campaigns without human supervision, had been deployed at scale by criminal organizations. The financial exploitation of elderly Americans is not a niche crime. It is not a minor consumer protection issue. It is among the largest financial crimes in the United States by total dollar volume, concentrated against the population least able to recover from devastating financial loss, and vastly undercounted in every official data set that purports to measure it. The $81.5 billion estimate is itself almost certainly too low. The 1 in 44 reporting rate documented in New York State, applied to FBI complaint data, would imply total annual elder fraud losses measured not in billions, but in the hundreds of billions. The wave is not coming. The wave is here, and most of it happens in silence.